pleasure to be here and having this opportunity to discuss some of our work we've been doing at Into Infinity, which is the company which I formed, to look at the nature of mathematics and the geometric universe. So I'm going to give a very, should we say, brief presentation today. A brief presentation, just because we've only got a short time. Obviously, I'm sure many people here know about sacred geometry, and maybe some of you have even practiced the art, compass construction. And that's really how I began. Found myself stranded about 10 years ago on a beach in India as a musician, actually, after I'd been doing quite a lot of work, dealing with a lot of the issues I think that you guys have been discussing today. And so I came from that background, and I was really in a sort of more, I suppose, quite isolated environment, and just coming to my own conclusions, in my own space. And so I want to share some of those ideas that came out of that experience. And it's very similar, the system that we have developed, to the standard sort of, you could say, metaphysical sacred geometric system. But there are a few key differences as well. So hopefully, if you're aware of this concept of sacred geometry, there's going to be terms like 5 platonic solids and things like that. If you know about those terms, hopefully, we won't go too fast. I hope it's not too low level. So I know we're going to be dealing with a lot of different levels of understanding of sacred geometry, because it's also a very vast subject, and probably most people have approached it from the spiritual, intuitive aspect, symbolism and all of that. But for me, I came from India, and I was studying, also surrounded by a lot of Vedic knowledge and sort of looking at some of that stuff. And that helped me to formulate a kind of, I suppose, a blueprint. And, it's this sort of funny thing, isn't it, about what is the truth? And quite often looking at truth, right? But I will say this. Everyone here is going to have their own truth. Your truth is what you construct, your version of reality. And if you can construct a truth that is close enough to the truth, then you can start to, what we call, balance that consciousness and start to come into a more harmonious aspect of your own being, balancing your logical and emotional self. And in return, that can also allow you to have more tolerance and all of the other things. And that's the spiritual path. And so there is that too, but we're not going to talk too much about that today, because I really want to say we're going to go short amount of time. And so I'm just going to really cover just some of these basic elements today of our new theory. Yeah? So I'm going to give you a quick introduction, introduce myself. I should mention as well, over the other side here, that's Heike Bielik. She's actually doing another event today, unfortunately, so couldn't be with us. But she will be here over the summer, and will be around as well if you want to talk afterwards. So what we have here is going to be running a very, I'm going to break this down in sort of simple terms. So we've only got sort of 5 sections that I would like to cover. And in our introduction, really what I'd like to look at more is just how this concept of geometry is actually all around us. And for many of you, you've probably seen the videos of fractal geometry in various disciplines such as this. And through that, we can start to qualify, that this thing called nature, this thing called reality, has at its foundation some kind of geometric function. Everything is unique. We're all unique. Everyone is different. You can't find a leaf that's the same as another leaf. And yet underneath that, there is a pattern, isn't there, that binds that sense of that thing. Therefore, when we look at the forests, we can see the trees, for example. And when we look at the trees, we can distinguish that's a tree and that's a tree. Yet the exact identity is never a complete reflection. There's always a slight deviation. So what we're really looking at then with sacred geometry is some of this underlying pattern. And I'm sure that most people are aware that that wasn't just confined to our modern exploration, that many of the ancient cultures that we once were very dominant on this earth had sacred geometry at their key belief systems. And we can find that encoded in their buildings and constructions. And what we really find is that, you know, the art of geometry seems to have followed the evolution of our civilization at various levels. For example, we know about the ancient Mesopotamian buildings and all of the buildings here. You can see some of them that are coming from South Mexico, Chichen Itza, which I was at this just recently. And the level of architecture and all that, and the knowledge of how to construct these things is really quite phenomenal. And just as we are sort of falling, let's say, into our dark ages, what's called the dark ages, we find the Islamic golden age rising up. And once again, it takes the mantle of geometry and pioneers so much in mathematics and all that, before Leonardo da Vinci and various other people come in and start to pioneer the Renaissance, which pretty much takes us up to modern times in science, up to Isaac Newton. And we're going to get into some more of that, some of those details, a bit more sciencey in a bit. But so maybe one of the most pioneering cultures was the ancient Greeks. Based in high society and philosophy. They emerged out of the Mycenaeans, which were much more, you could say in a sense, more warlike. But you could say after the fall of the golden age of the Greeks, as they like to call it, there was much more arising of philosophical nature. And one of those philosophies was by Plato. It's called Plato's Cave. And I think it's a very good analogy which we can still represent what we're really talking about in its metaphorical image today. So you can say here are the people, they're slaves and they're blindfolded and they're in the cave. And what we're really doing is we're just observing the shadows on the wall of the cave and believing that that is the actual reality and the truth. And I think quite a lot of people on this earth are actually building plans, in the future based on those shadows rather than actually an understanding of how the mechanism is working to project those shadows. And I think that the light side of all of that is that would be the big joke on some of them. But anyway, as we can see here, the light is shining through, and there's a puppet display. It's a game, right? It's a game, and that's what reality is. It's a matrix, or it's a simulation, we say, and we're playing this game. And what's the objective then is, to actually realise it's a game, and step into our spiritual self and start to enjoy reality, right? That's the foundation, as simple as that, yeah? Now, I know that thought is quite difficult for certain individuals on this planet to grasp, but it is, once they do, they can realise you can have everything, And that's one of the benefits of pioneering a more sort of, should we say, metaphysical consciousness, is that we start to balance the intuition of what we want inside and what's going on outside, and can come to more grounded conclusions. Now, sacred geometry has developed quite recently, but has been quite prevalent throughout our history. We have here the image of something called the flower of life. Now, there's been many things talked about the flower of life, seed of life, and all of this tapestry. Some of it, very positive, talking about lots of spiritual meaning. And then we have the other side, some people talking of daisies of death and various things like that, and a lot of speculation about what is it all about. And really, in a sense, what we're saying is it is a blueprint. We say it's the foundation of the matrix, actually, but we don't necessarily say it's like a neutral thing. It's just this is how the experience works, and this is a very simple design that if you start to construct with a compass, it will be one of the first things that you can create. In fact, we've got our symbol here from the Expand Your Horizons, and that happens to be the first step of the creation of the flower of life or seed of life, and it happens to be represented quite heavily in Glastonbury as well. And from that Vesta Pisces, this is the tapestry that will emerge. And you can see that it has been utilised throughout ancient history. And what we're doing today is we're starting to reinvigorate our interest, just as we did in the Renaissance period then, so that we can step forward into a new sense of our own self. So how does that pattern emerge? Well, we've kind of got our own kind of, if you like, our own way of sort of qualifying that, because what we found was that when we were starting to draw this sacred geometry, is that the terminologies seemed to sort of change and differ, and we needed a bit more of a precise definition for our sort of framework. And so what we can see here is you go from the circle, and once you create 7 concentric circles that all fit together perfectly, and it creates a seal called the seed of life. And we say that's the first step. And then as you expand that, you can get into something called the flower of life. If you expand it again, you get something called the moonflower. That's a new terminology we're trying to introduce, or we might call it the flower of light. You can have a vote on that if you want. And then we can have the next one, which is called the flower of heaven. And there were certain reasons why we wanted to use those terminologies based on some of these numbers, and we're not going to go into too much of that, into which these structures are forming, the number of circles. But regardless of that, what we can see is that once we get up to 61 circles, then we can draw 13 whole circles out of that, and then we get a Metatron's cube blueprint. And what you can do is you can use, by connecting all of the center points of that together, those 13 circles, we can create the projection that you see here of some 3D solids. Now, I do have a few of those solids here. This is the tetrahedron, for example. It's a platonic solid. These are all regular solids. Let's see what else we have. An octahedron here. This is another one. It's right there. And we have the cube. And so one of the things that's quite interesting is you will see that that blueprint appears actually just in the flower of life. And what's more, they kind of all fit together into quite a nice pattern. You can actually fit them. You see that? That's called the Merkaba, and it just fits into there. So that's part of the blueprint that we were talking about. And then on top of that, you can also get this shape, which is the dodecahedron. You can see it there. It's projected from the outer ring. And then that is the jewel that fits inside like a two-piece thing into this called the icosahedron. Yeah? And those are called the 5 platonic solids. Let's put that there, so you can sort of just have those there, and we can see what we're talking about. So just as there are an infinite number of regular 2D shapes, that's fair, and when we step into the third dimension, suddenly we have a limitation of just 5 types of 3D shapes. So that's been a fairly standard blueprint within the field of sacred geometry. Is everyone fairly aware of some of that, or is this new information? Yeah? Has that been clear? Is everyone okay? Yeah? We're not rushing. Any questions?
No spheres.
The sphere, yeah, the sphere is not classed as a platonic solid because the definition is the straight edges and it all having. But some people could say all of these shapes can be encompassed within a sphere. And that means they are the only shapes that are regular that can be encompassed in a sphere. And what that means is that these dots, these corner points, will equally touch that surface. And then you can see that there will be a certain number of points that, once again, it limits, doesn't it, what points could appear on that sphere to make shapes and things like that. Yeah? All good? Very good. So we've been talking about the number 5. Yeah, and I always found the number 5 quite interesting. We have the, everyone knew music, you've got 5 notes on a piano keyboard. Yeah? And those 5 notes, we call the pentatonic scale, the evidence of the existence of that goes back well over 40,000 years. And then we have the white notes on the keyboard. And that was all due to a guy called Pythagoras, so you can see maybe that goes back 1,200 years, 1,200 BC max, maybe, when they were sort of looking at that sort of stuff. So you can see music's made a massive development, but that pentatonic scale has been with us for quite some time. So we're just thinking about the concept of the number 5. And so what I'd really like to do is maybe, as we step, we have this 3 dimensions now. The question is then, what happens when we start to step into the 4th dimension? And somebody mentioned the sphere, very important. So let's start there. So really what we have in the sphere is like a 3D sort of object. But when we come into the 4th dimension, you could say, we could clarify that as a torus. Now there is something called a 4D sphere that's slightly different. Imagine if you took a torus and you just squished it into a sphere. That could technically be called a 4D sphere. But can you imagine, if you took two balls and you started to pull those apart, you start to develop a torus field. And the further apart you pull that, it will turn eventually into a ring donut. You know, it starts like that. So there are different types of torus field. But what you can notice is that it has a point where it goes in, this particular field here, goes in and it touches on a point right at our centre. And what's happening then is that energy, you could say, let's do it this way, it's moving upwards, it's going up and it's going up, and then it sort of got to go out and around, and then we get to this point here where it's a complete circle, and then the circle collapses back in and it turns back into a dot. And so here what we're saying is, you can see a little image at the top here, as the dot expands into a circle, so the circle collapses into a dot. And this is how we're starting to perceive the new concepts that we're pioneering, what we call the fourth dimension of time, based in Euclidean geometry. So this is a slightly new concept, but what we're really saying is moments are being rendered, if you like, within this matrix. And the rendering process is enabled through fourth dimensional geometry. 3 dimensions of time, and the w-axis, as we call it, is that rotational axis. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this fourth dimension shortly. But let us think first, so we've got this torus field, so let's just think, where do those torus fields actually, where do we find them? And we find them in all sorts of natural phenomena. And the atom, you could say, is full of torus fields. S-orbital arrangements of electron pairs form torus field arrangements, we say. And those are the first that appear in the atom. You know, hydrogen and helium are s-orbital atoms. And once that first, the symbol on the periodic table, those first 2 elements form, you get what's called a noble gas, helium. And so really what we're saying is, and that remains, at the centre of every single subsequent atom, it's that torus field. It binds that energy to the nucleus. And if we move up, we find that also cells themselves, I know there's probably people here working within the healing field that know that cells have an energetic bioenergy. Yeah? And there's all sorts of gradients and sort of that happening across the cell. But you can also say that, if you think about how a cell divides, it's going through a process where it starts to weave this central column and reflect itself off. Before making that division, it's forming a torus field energy in order to go through that process. And so you can see that the torus there once again operates in its time-space function to allow cellular division to commence. And then we have the Earth itself. We are beings who are sat upon the Earth. The Earth has a north and a south pole. We've looked at some of the pole shifting sort of stuff that's going on there. But it moves around, but it's very important, isn't it? It is even within this time-space continuum that we are unified on the surface of the Earth. Whether you believe it's a flat Earth or a round Earth, I don't care really. But we're unified right now in time. Yeah? And I, as a musician, know that because when people play out on time in my band, it sounds horrible, right? And so we try to bring everyone back into time so everyone can have a great time. Yeah, that's the idea of music, isn't it? And so here we are, we know that time is unified across the surface of this Earth and is inside this torus field, which we say is a fourth dimensional field. Okay? And then if we go out to the solar system, we can see, yes, the field just grows, it gets bigger, doesn't it? We have something, this field is immense, it comes out of the sun at its centre, it's actually we're at a sort of slight angle as we move through the galaxy to the galactic plane, our solar system, and there's the heliaxial model. But I think what you can generally say is that we're acting, it's like a sphere of energy, it's like a 4D sphere that is actually moving through that galactic plane, and that creates maybe another scale of time. Time functioning at different scales, divided by these toroidal fields. And that is why we have manifestation of phenomena at certain scales within the universal structure. And so the final structure there is the galactic structure. And obviously we do have galaxies that compile themselves into superstructure galaxies, but the structure really remains the same. They just get bigger types of galaxy. And as far as we're aware, and we're aware of, say we might not be aware of everything, but as far as our awareness has stretched thus far, and we've got the James Webb telescope looking out into the depths of space, finding what more galaxies that are larger than we ever thought possible. So that just shows us really that this fabric of galactic space is immense. And as far as we can tell, it might be infinite. But each galaxy is contained within its own torus field and its own time-space, let's call it that, yeah? And when we start to see this separation of time and space through this mechanism, then geometry starts to take on a whole new meaning, because we can also begin to expand that into a correlation with the 5 platonic solids, yeah? And so actually it's quite interesting that those solids nest together in a certain way. Here is the octahedron. We call that, we aligned that with the atomic dimension. We have aligned the tetrahedron with the cellular dimension, and we called that water. We took the cube and we aligned that with the Earth. That's a very traditional interpretation. We took the dodecahedron and we aligned that with the solar dimension. And we took the icosahedron and associated that with the galactic dimension. So this is a slightly different model to the traditional model, and maybe what we'll do next is we'll have a quick look at why this model is different from what is the, you could say, the standard metaphysical model. Yeah? So why do we decide to unify these things in this way? Well, let's just go into a small concept about some of these relationships that exist between these solids. So as you can see, the tetrahedron is often considered to be the smallest, and so quite often we consider that to be the first. It has only 4 faces, but quite often we also see it compiled into, as I showed before, the star tetrahedron. So it has a kind of, this is its kind of unique property. It has a kind of duality to it. And so duality, in a sense, can arise out of this form. So it is an important form, undoubtedly. Yeah? And then we have the octahedron, and you can see that's got its slightly bigger, it's got 6 faces, and it's got, 6 vertices, which means corners, and 8 faces. Now, if you notice that the cube is sat there next to it, it has exactly the opposite. It has 8 corners, or vertices, and it has 6 faces. And so what that means is that we can sort of take a cube like this, and if I can show you just there, we can place an octahedron in its centre, yeah? So that each one of its corners directly touches the centre of its face, like that. So you can see that there a little bit, yeah? And we're going to get a little bit more into that nesting, but that's what's called a dual. They're called platonic duals, because the corners match the faces. It's as simple as that. And that starts to give us an idea about how the structure is emerging, because the last 2 solids, these 2 here, are also duals of each other. They fit together perfectly inside of one another. So now that we have an idea about how they fit together slightly, we've got this idea now of the concept of 5 elements. Now, it was quite interesting, the emergence of this theory in Greece, because the 5th element, ether, as we call it, was actually defined as quintessence by Aristotle later on. We were only using 4 elements for quite a while, and the 5th one was added. What seemed to happen was, when we lost knowledge of particularly the dodecahedron, is that sense of the ether seemed to disappear. And then more recently, it's sort of been, it was more recently discovered in the modern Renaissance, once we started recompile all of this, the theory of 5 elements and its association was kind of standardized. But we did that without real consideration of maybe some of the latest findings and discoveries of how the universe works, the periodic table and everything like that, which we know about today. So what we're really saying is we would associate fire with this atomic realm, and we give that the form of this octahedral space. And quite often what we see, as we're going to show later, is that there's a reason for that being something to do with the orbital shells, which we'll talk about shortly. But water we would assign instead to this shape, because actually water molecules are tetrahedral in nature. and cellular dimension lives within the water. So you can see how the blueprint now that we're employing starts to sort of build up in a kind of logical sense compared to what we know. We put the cube here as Earth, and that's been standard in both models, and that's primarily because if you experience the Earth, you may find it appears to be very flat. We use Pythagorean theorem for constructions, and that's all based on the right-angled triangle. Because actually the cube can fit nicely inside the dodecahedron, it actually has a rotation where you can fit 5 cubes within the dodecahedron. We've said that's the next one up, and we give that the dimension of air, because if you imagine it, something that's next, the lightest, if you imagine coming off the waters, as it rises up, it's the pranic energy that we're breathing, and all of that stuff is associated within the air. The whole universe, in a sense, is breathing energy in and out, and that's that rotation of that energy field, and that's what we say is the infinite energy that is passing through the universe and keeping it in equilibrium. And that's why we get such things as the phi and the golden ratio. That all starts to come down, and you notice it spirals down and it curls through reality, and as it does, plant life attaches to it and builds things in Fibonacci sequences. I hope that's not too much terminology. And the final form, why we call that the ether, is because out of all the forms, really, this is the largest one, and it's got a very nice central midsection that can rotate independently of its caps. And so later we're going to see how that fits into our model. So each one of these we associated with a slightly different element compared to what would normally be associated with it. Yeah? So you can see there's the traditional model and its orientation, and then we've changed that slightly. Okay? So I hope I haven't upset anyone there who's very passionate about sacred geometry. When we do this and we structure it like this, what starts to happen is that the entire set now becomes nested in a particular order. It's like a kind of jigsaw puzzle that starts to fit itself together. And what's quite interesting is that we start to have just 3 spheres now that can encompass the whole set. And so fire, the octahedron, will be in its own inner sphere, and then we'll have 3 of the platonic solids all sharing the same sphere, and that becomes the liquid and solid gaseous states of matter that science is aware of. And then we come into the ether, or the plasma state, which with science we call it the 4th state of matter, which once again, it's one of those non-tangible states. And so, in a similar sort of way, if you just think of our experience of these things, in very simple terms, you can't touch fire, you can't touch the electricity, but we can interact with the atoms and the molecules, the liquid and the air. And so the model itself starts to represent, say, as well as sort of the concepts that are being purported by science and magic, you could say, we're using 5 elements here, a platonic model, but it also starts to reflect our nature of interaction with the system of reality. So how are we doing? All good? Yeah, very good. Is there any questions about that? Because we're going to go now into more about now the why we're saying this a little bit more and what the model is. Yeah. So we've given like a nice overview. So if you've got any questions, hopefully in this section we'll start to iron some of those things out. So one of the things I quite like are simple experiences, and I often think you can't get much more simple than 1, 2, 3. And that was always a very important number in Om and various spiritual traditions that you can find out. Yeah? And so I'm not going to go too much into that, but if I hold the 3 in the middle and I give it a twist, you see, just a simple twist, I bind the thing. You see what I mean? And that creates something like a density, a point of density in the middle. And if I wanted to, let's say I've only got a 2D space, like a wall, all I can really do is I can just kind of try and orientate these so they would spread out evenly on the surface of water. There's the surface of the water going on. Now, if you want to tie in that into some of the biblical technology, the story of 7 days of creation, you'll find out that everything was created on the surface of the water. You can also find out that in Vedic knowledge, the Brahma emerges from the veil, from the belly button of Vishnu, who's beneath the waters, and the lotus flower opens, and then Brahma sat there and he creates everything on the surface of the ocean. So the surface of the ocean is a metaphor for a two-dimensional space. And one of the other Vedic metaphors that's quite useful, we found, was something called Indra's net, which basically means you have this flower of life tapestry. It's the natural tapestry that was coming out of concentric circles, and because all the nodes or the dots become equally spaced, you have something called equilibrium, we say, yeah? And so we have this sort of tapestry, and what happens is each one of the triangles, they come together and they form a hexagon at the centre of the seed of life. So, here it is. There's our seed of life. And as we turn that there, let's say we just want to rotate something. Like we rotated it to bind it, didn't we? We just rotated it. If I rotate that into a 3D space now, you see, I've just rotated, nothing much, and found another state of equilibrium. This time I've increased from 2D into 3D. And what I've done is I've really created this form here. It's the octahedron. You see? As the flower of life expands from the second dimension, through rotation, it can start to create this shape, this octahedron. And this octahedron is quite important. We're not going to go into too much detail, but if I give you it as this form, if I can get it to sit right, this is an octahedron here. This was something that Buckminster Fuller termed the jitterbug. And what happens is, imagine it's all just rotation. As it rotates further, here we get the icosahedron as it sort of opens out like that. Yeah, it opens out into the icosahedron like that. Yeah, and then it turns into the cube octahedron. Yeah. So this is something called the jitterbug. Probably better to see it online. Mine was just falling apart. But the main thing I wanted to take away is that as this rotational process is enacting itself, reality is being created and destroyed within the blink of an eye. You don't see the creation and destruction. You just see the movement of time, the images that you are processing, which form the story of your life. But behind it, there is a matrix mechanism, and we believe it is operating through this concept, this geometric concept of rotation. And once we've got the octahedron formed, as you can see, it can now expand further, and we can find a cubic form by placing a duality onto that structure. And duality is quite important because at the basis and the foundation of atoms and things like that is the concept of electron pairs. And once we start to think about all of that, that is such a foundational level that it starts to now come into another sense that once we get this, we can start to create this structure here, with this octahedron at the centre. And as it rotates, it's touching, and then it stops touching, and it comes into alignment, and it switches off. And it comes back, and it switches on. Everything is turning on and off like a rhythm. And that is, in a sense, if you think about it, why you are so attracted to certain types of music with 4/4 rhythms. That music is keying in to the very matrix itself. And when you embody or dance within that music, you're connecting to the rhythm of the universe. You see? And that's why the numbers 4 and 4 play a role. Because this form here is rotating, and you can see if I hold it that way, it looks like it's got triangles, but here, hidden inside, is the square. Now, there are 3/4 rhythms that are also quite prevalent. If you look into Yoruba and stuff like that, that is quite often used in spiritual work, and that's that 3/4 rhythm, da, 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 and it's got more swing. It's also used in sort of courtships and things like that. Cubans know a lot about that with the clave, where they combine the 3 and the 2. But fundamentally, it's all based on these simple geometries and rotations. So let's have a recap. Here are the platonic solids. They all fit together like a beautiful blueprint, and we've just shown a little bit of the mechanism of how this thing is turning on and turning off. And you can imagine then that produces certain qualities to the reality. And so, as we said here, the octahedron is the only form that combines both the 2D square with the 2D triangle. And in our work, what we see is that those are the two types of fundamental forms that can be constructed using just two colours. If with the flower of life tapestry as a hexagon, you need three colours in order to fill that so that no cell has the same colour connected to it. So that's the unique quality of this initial form. And it also starts to point to the concept of light and why electromagnetic waves are orientated at 90 degrees to each other. Wherever you go in the universe, any point in space you sample, you can have an electric and magnetic field, and wherever you measure the electric field, the magnetic field will go off at a 90-degree angle. That's called the right-hand rule. And so what we have here then is we move above that, then when we start to sort of create that star tetrahedron, that unity you could say, and we said that we created this cube. And what we need in order to experience a reality is a dimension of existence that can be scaled in the third dimension infinitely without leaving any gaps. And that's called a space-filling solid. And so space, as we say, is flat. You can use Pythagorean theorem to examine distant stars and everything works. Now there's been confusion with that because Einstein's theory of curvature of time-space. But the time or the gravity field is curving that which is flat. And so this is the only shape that can represent that from all of these. And what's interesting is that those first three solids are also the only shapes that can be represented into infinite dimensions. So you look beyond the fifth, beyond the sixth, beyond the seventh, the structure continues. But the dodecahedron and icosahedron only have equivalents in the fourth and fifth dimension that we know of. The icosahedron, or the dodecahedron, as we mentioned, encodes this thing called the golden ratio. And that aligns proportion within the things that grow from the system. As the system enacts moments of time, the structure gradually evolves, and it does through, we say, through golden spirals and golden relationships, which when they attach themselves to cellular points and things like that, like the little, you could say the quantized reality, it starts to translate itself into Fibonacci numbers. And finally, we have the last form, the icosahedron, with its top cap and bottom cap. And if you remove those two caps, what you can see, there is a pentagonal form that is it's a prism, and that prism can be rotated. And what we see then is that that's very useful for creating a field that can go from north to south, yet at the same time provide a rotational function, such as that we find in planets, suns, and possibly even our own selves. This is a blueprint, a metaphysical blueprint. We think it helps us to understand ourselves, to understand also our own energetic patterns. And what we'd like to do now is take you through some of the reasons why we believe this to be so, from a more grounded perspective. Because so far everything I've said could be, just me making things up. It does follow a logic of geometry. And the logic of geometry allows us to explore the metaphysical consequences through number and through expressions such as the physical form. This is a tactile expression of mathematics. And so how do we know what some of the sayings, where do we actually see these shapes in reality? So let us begin then at the largest scale. At the largest scales of the universe, we have this concept, the egg-carton universe. But really, when you start to see what science is saying, is that once we started to look at how these galaxy clusters are arranged, it appears they've been dribbled over the edges of an octahedral form. An octahedral grid will, when it's pieced together, will leave empty spaces as well. And so at its largest scale, here we have this octahedral form. Yeah? And in a sense, what we could say is that that octahedral form then can be just reflected down into the concept of the galaxy itself. And so that octahedral structure is something which we find paramount, which we could call defines the first boundaries of things. And we're going to see it in the atom in just a second. As far as solar, if we go down, remember we had our galactic dimension. And really we could say that that sort of could be represented by this, with this pentagonal prism. And we have, I don't know if you're aware, but the laws of Newtonian gravity tend to break down the galactic scale. And so what we're proposing is that the reason for that uniform rotation of the galactic forms is because of the geometry of space at that scale. If we come down a level from that scale, we can see Johannes Kepler, who did amazing work studying the laws of planetary motion, and originally came up with the idea that the planets were nested within sacred geometry. And there's been a lot of debate as to whether that was true or not. But I think if you go even to, if you go down the road, you can find the little book of coincidences by Wooden Books, and I recommend that book, particularly as a sort of Glastonbury, I think a Glastonbury author. And so what we do is we could say that some of the geometries and the designs, even in the second dimension, do actually follow a very interesting pattern. And what we can see here is that it starts with the triangle. You can see the triangle there with the Mercury-Venus connection. But also what's quite interesting here is the Mercury-Earth connection. And the reason that one's quite interesting is because of its five-pointed star. We said about this five-pointed star projecting this phi energy right the way through the solar system. But it also defines the size of Mercury and the size of the Earth. So the circle in the middle of that five-pointed star is the size of Mercury, whereas the circle on the outside represents the size of the Earth, as well as, and I say as well as, the mean, which means the average orbit of those planets. So that's us, everybody. And not just that, you can see that from the Earth out to Saturn, we have a 15-pointed star. It's multiplied by 3, and it creates the similar ratios between orbitary rotation, how far away from the Sun are these planets, and also the size of these planets. And Saturn itself, as a hexagonal, you could say, north and south pole, operates as a particular energy field, which we say projects a certain energy right way through to the Sun. And that's happening with the phi. And then as we go in between that, you can see there's something else here with Jupiter and Mars. They form the square, which is above us, and then that square gets projected onto us. And this is like the esoteric knowledge of the solar system. But what's quite interesting is that Jupiter seal there, where you see the seed of life pattern, or the Star of David pattern, can actually be represented also as a set of nested octahedra nested inside this. This is what that blueprint looks like in 3D. So we find the same blueprints there in the second dimension, and we can translate them. Now there's a lot more I could say about why these geometries are appearing in our solar system, to do also with the sweet spot where our Earth finds itself within that system, whereby life just happens to be able to emerge. And that's quite a unique thing, and we should recognise that this might be, and science will say, a coincidence because it changes over time. Whereas what we're saying is no, it's a synchronous event, and that's why we exist. And if it goes out of time, there'll be another place in the great galactic where it'll come into resonance, and that's where life will exist. And that's the nature of life. Now, moving on, let's go now down, because we're at the solar dimension. Let's talk a little bit more about the Earth dimension and organic structures. I won't go too much into Earth, because we can talk about the 5 biogeochemical cycles that power the planet. We do whole courses on this stuff, and we use this Platonic model to teach ecology and how the CO2, how the oxygen, and how all of that stuff works. And we can teach that very simply through geometry. But I would give it a thought now, because if we think about most of the universe is constructed from what we call helium. Hydrogen, sorry, to get that right. Hydrogen and helium. In about a 75 to 25%, with a small gap in between for everything else. But if we imagine that, as I said before, that what you've got there is you've got a hydrogen atom here, then a hydrogen atom here, and they want to bond together to form a line, a diatomic molecule it's called. And so those diatomic molecules include things also like oxygen. The oxygen that we breathe is made of oxygen in a diatomic form. But most of the gas that we're experiencing is also nitrogen. About 80% of it is nitrogen. And once again, it's got a triple bond and it's being held together. And what happens really is that, along with the other biochemical cycles of phosphorus and sulfur, which come up from under the Earth, which also start as diatomic molecules at high pressure, as they come down, or as they start to unify at this pressure level, shall we say, where we exist, they make a fundamental transformation into a tetrahedral molecule. And tetrahedral molecules include water, ammonia, methane, phosphate and sulfate, and they form the background of the molecular structures, or they absorbed into the organic dimension, if you like, to become what we call life. That's how life works. And if you compare that to the inorganic structure, what you look at on a periodic table, that when something is inorganic, it tends to form on a cubic grid. There are certain exceptions where we find hexagonal grids and various cube octahedral grids and things like that. And the octahedron also plays a very key role. As you can see, some of it is here, as you can see, with the extra dots at the centre of the face. That's really just an octahedron nested in a cube. And that becomes the majority of the structures that we find that form the non-organic compounds, including crystalline structures, which just are more perfect geometry. So let's just move down now into the atom. We mentioned the atom before. Here is a nucleus, and the general model is that you have this tight nucleus full of protons and neutrons, and then you have these electrons forming some kind of cloud outside of it. But it turns out that most people have got the model here, which was the Bohr model from school, where these electrons are kind of circulating like little planets around a nucleus. That was disproven a long time ago, well over 100 years ago. Instead, what we could say is there is an electron cloud, and it's generally seen as like this chaotic kind of bunch of fuzzy dots in a rather bizarre time-space superposition. But what we could really say is that it also exhibits geometry. There are 4 types of orbital, S, P, D and F, and here we have an example of the S orbital structure, the P orbital structure, where you can see these red ones are actually lobes that are forced outside of the atom on an X, Y and Z axis, which is exactly the model that we showed coming here. This is actually a set of P orbitals. And why these are important is because when these form, you get something called a noble gas, and that finishes, if you like, that line of the periodic table, and then you're on to the next line of the periodic table. The octahedron structures the matter. And that's why we say it's an impenetrable boundary. You need that. That's actually the difference between something called a boson, which is to do with light, which means you can have multiple different frequencies and all of that superimposed over the same space, and matter, where it's called fermions, which are only appearing in their unique position, quantized. And because then we have this unique phenomena, they have something called quantum spin, which basically means, if I describe quantum spin like this, for a boson, if I made one rotation, like that, you can see I'm turning around, right? And everyone would agree, I've made one rotation and I'm back to point one, okay? Now, if I was to look at an electron, what I'd need to do is I'd need to turn like that, and if I turn this far around, maybe that might be one rotation, or should we say maybe it spins, that might be half a rotation, you see what I mean? I need to spin twice around in order to make one rotation in my reality. That is what is called quantum spin. And we are saying the reason that is because objects inside the atom are in a higher dimension, and they can spin in a fourth dimensional way. And we'll explain what that means now. When we think about this symbol here, we call it the Vesica Pisces. The Vesica Pisces, as you can see also from the symbol of Glastonbury Symposium and many other symbols, is a very interesting form, because once we draw a circle and then we place another circle on it, we create two what we call nodes in sacred geometry. And from that moment on, the rules are very simple. You just add nodes, you just add circles to nodes, and then that's how the blueprint emerges. And that's how simple that whole pattern is for the seed of life, and for all of this complexity to arise. Now, this foundation, I was having a quick conversation with somebody just before this talk, and one of the things that we offer is a very simplified version of science, which allows us to create a very nice geometric sketch. We're not going to go into too much detail, it's called dimensionless science. But what we can do is you can sort of say that the speed of light could be considered to be 300,000 kilometers a second, or if we took a lot of zeros off, we could say 3. And I prefer the number 3 because it's simpler. And then we can just, scale our imagination. And if you look here, we normally have a radius of the circle of 1, and so actually going across the Vesica Pisces is actually a distance of 3. And under those conditions, if we were to imagine, if light is in a vacuum, that's the speed it's going. But as we start to step into something called density, density starts to slow light down. It doesn't actually slow it down, it makes it resonate differently, giving it the appearance that it's slowing down. And as it starts to resonate differently until it gets to something so dense it reflects back off. Now sound, we say, is another important part of the universe, and it works the other way around. If in a vacuum, sound doesn't want to travel. But when the vacuum starts to get extremely dense, as it does inside atoms and sort of that sort of stuff, particularly inside nucleuses of black holes and all of that, then you start to get tremendous amounts of density, and so the speed of sound starts to go up. And when you do the equations, it turns out that it's the square root of the speed of light becomes the maximum speed in this intense density that sound could ever possibly travel. And so really what we have there is that within the Vesica Pisces itself is the perfect encoding of this relationship. Because if you imagined it was going 3 across, you can see that from point to point, the distance is the square root of 3, i.e. the fastest speed of sound. So even within the first structures, what we're starting to see are fundamental relationships to light and sound, which we believe govern much of the universe we are experiencing.
5 minutes.
Fantastic. So let us now just point to this object here. We're just going to take you up now into the 4th dimension. So that was talking then from a very foundational level, and we've shown how the cube can build. And when we talked about that 4th dimension, remember we had that torus field that we were building. The same applies to other 4th dimensional shapes. And so here what we have is what we call a stereographic projection of a 4th dimensional hypercube. And how that really works is, really these cubes would be appearing in exactly the same space. But if you imagine we can sort of have a light source that we could train on each cube, and if we drew the light source back, it would shrink one of the cubes, or blow up one of the cubes, so that we could see the difference between them. And then when we put them in rotation, we would have an understanding of what this shape looks like from our 3D perspective. We don't see the fourth dimension, we experience it. And we're experiencing the cubic dimension right now. As we sit here, time is being rendered. And as each moment is being rendered, it fills a complete image in unity. And what we're trying to suggest then is that this is much more of a sensible mechanism to begin approaching the nature of time-space itself. From an infinite energy is moving from zero dimension into the second dimension, expanding. It hits the third dimension and there is a limitation now of just 5 solids, which as it pushes through rotates into the fourth dimension, and there are 6 types of solid there, and as it pushes through it escapes towards infinite dimension, and there it can continue expanding into infinity. This provides us with a different model of the universe and ourselves. It suggests there is an infinite amount of energy that can be tapped, that is passing through this geometric structure which we determine as life, which we experience, and that those experiences are passing through us, coloured by our energy, and through the universe itself, and that this energy is never ending. That is very different from the conservation of energy, which sees the universe as being a limited, closed system. We are saying it is an open system expanding into infinite dimension. Now let's get down to then the consciousness implications of such a hypothesis. If we understand ourselves, then we believe we can understand the universe itself. And if we understand the universe, we can also understand ourselves. What we have done is we have looked quite deeply into a geometric blueprint of the atom and devised or come up with a metaphysical geometric model which we believe, if it is adopted by somebody, can start to improve their capacity in many ways. From our emotional and spiritual being to our intellect and logic, sacred geometry is a pathway into both the spiritual domain and the scientific. Some of the things that we teach are various methodologies for utilising this energy field. For example, torus meditations, such as the ones that we provided, allow us to bring the dot from this consistently outside of ourselves, worrying what is actually happening out here all the time, and start to bring it back here and center yourself in your own dimension and realize your own power. This, for me, is the ultimate solution, because everything in the game that I see being played is about putting your mind and your dot inside yourself. And once we overcome that issue, you can begin to step into your own spiritual power. And we believe that this blueprint unifies a scientific and metaphysical approach to such a process. Development of human consciousness. The geometric universe explores, as our book explores many of these concepts, and we go through much of how the universe is constructed, as well as the concepts such as heaven and everything else like that. I would like to say we've covered the 5 realms, a new platonic solid model, a little bit of a look at the multidimensional space model, and some of the application within the geometric universe theory. To accompany this, we have 2 books, one has actually just been released this week, called Hello Geometry, and the other, The Geometric Universe. The Geometric Universe is available today, I think with a £5 discount upstairs. So if you want to look into more of our theory, we have a full colour page book. It has also templates at the end. And finally, if you would like to join us, we have a 4D yoga retreat coming up in Portugal, which we have been pioneering now for a few years. It's a great experience. You get a chance to draw, you get a chance to relax, you get a chance to it's all organic food and everything like that. And you can come and talk to us after the show if you'd like to just talk. I'd just like to thank once again everyone for participating in these important discussions, and it's really wonderful to see so many people in Glastonbury pioneering new thoughts in consciousness, and I, Colin Power, wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, there you go. Now you understand a lot more about the way the universe works, don't you? Thank you, Colin. That was really fantastic. Okay, it's tea. So please be back in half an hour. We're going to have Nancy Collette talking about